When I was really young, my mom was a flight attendant, so she was gone a lot.
A memory also from childhood of constantly being separated from my nanny because she went to school at night. So there is always that drama of her leaving and coming back.
As I've explored it as an adult, that I think I may have had kind of an emotionally absent mother in my life. There physically, but not able to be emotionally available.
Looking back on it, I was conscious of the fact that she was leaving, and there was always that, when is she going to leave again? Because I didn't know. So,
well, the problems that we start to face as far as attachment goes starts at birth to basically 18 months and up to 3 years. So we want to make sure that the primary care figure, the primary attachment figure, is there.
Although you see the world different than me, sometimes I can touch upon the wonders that you see, and all the new colors and pictures.
Today we're experiencing a societal shift in how we connect. The world is getting smaller, and input from the outside world is increasing exponentially. We sit our kids down in front of screens where they get their sense of connection to the world, often replacing the presence of a mother or father with some sort of technological babysitter.
Today, if you just plop your child in front of a video screen, they're not getting the feedback. They're only getting one-way processing. They're only getting the visual input or the auditory input and not getting the mirroring. There is no digesting of material going on with the infant.
The archetypal orphan child becomes one that is consistently seeking to return home for connection. We understand that when a child doesn't have the security of early connection and attachment, it sets up a life of struggle in returning home to self or others. Jung said that the child represents the potential future, and the child archetype is a symbol of the developing personality. The Matchbox Girl, Little Orphan Annie, Luke Skywalker, and Oliver Twist are all familiar to us as beloved story figures. These children's narrative is that they were pushed away from the nurture and care of primary caregivers, creating a drive to pursue connection to those who abandoned them. We who stand in witness to these stories, films, and plays empathize with the plight of these protagonists. We feel deeply within our own psyches an innate desire to connect back to those we came from, in the return from our wandering, in a struggle to de-orphanize ourselves. The fact that there is still a proliferation of archetypal stories of the abandoned child, and the fact that the world resonates with those stories, tells us that we have not yet moved into an era of the secure child. John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott made strides in this particular emphasis in psychology, making conscious that which was unconscious for parents raising their children and for helpers who worked with them. In the 1950s and 1960s, psychodynamic theorists John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott worked independently yet simultaneously developing theories of childhood attachment. They spoke about the child's physical and psychological growth and overall well-being. Their collective groundbreaking work gave a solid foundation for others who would come after them. Mary Ainsworth, Mary Main, and Harry Harlow's work with rhesus monkeys have been building blocks to Bowlby and Winnicott's initial research.
They both seem to really establish that we are biologically programmed to make attachments in our life, and these attachments aren't just about connection, they're about our survival.
They both were interested in the primary attachment figure and the presence of the primary attachment figure in the newborn's life.
John Bowlby was born in London in 1907 and was raised in a family of 6 children. His primary caregiver was his nanny. His parents believed that too much parental affection and attention would spoil a child, and consequently, Bowlby had very little interaction with his mother. At the age of 7, Bowlby was sent to boarding school. He would later describe this as a traumatic experience, arguing that it was detrimental to his well-being. According to Joseph Schwartz, author of Cassandra's Daughter, A History in Psychoanalysis, Bowlby was recorded as saying, "I wouldn't send a dog away to boarding school at the age of 7. Donald Winnicott was born in Plymouth, Devon, England in 1896. He was the youngest of 3 children and later described his childhood as oppressed by his mother, his 2 sisters, and his nanny. His early experience with his mother's mental health problems led him towards helping other people troubled with psychological problems. Winnicott attended boarding school at the Leys Boarding School in Cambridge. Like Bowlby, the experience of boarding school was difficult for him. Winnicott fractured his clavicle at one point and recorded in a diary saying that he had wished that he could treat himself. Both men later attended medical school, working with children in their respective fields. Bowlby as a child psychiatrist and later as a psychoanalyst, Winnicott a pediatrician and later a psychoanalyst. They worked under the highly influential psychoanalyst at the time, Melanie Klein. During the Second World War, both men found themselves in settings that put them on a common trajectory in the field that they ended up being most known for. John Bowlby became a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps and worked briefly with the World Health Organization as a mental health consultant, taking an interest in several orphans who were separated from their families during the war. This interest inspired him to further examine the work of Anna Freud, Renee Spitz, Dorothy Burlingham, and Melanie Klein. Donald Winnicott became an associate member of the British Psychoanalytical Society in 1934, a child analyst in 1935, a full member in 1936, a training analyst in 1940, and served as a consultant psychiatrist to the government evacuation schema for London's children and treated many who were displaced from their homes by wartime evacuation. While Melanie Klein's work was very influential in the work for both men, her theory that a child's fantasies about relationships determined a child's ability to have good attachment caused Donald Winnicott and John Bowlby to veer away from Klein's theory. They determined that child development and environmental factors, most specifically a child's relationship to primary caregivers, was the critical factor in the ability for a child to attach. John Bowlby's theory of attachment, from the evolutionary theory of attachment perspective, suggests that children come into the world biologically pre-programmed to form attachments with others for the purposes of survival, and this attachment is to one primary figure. His core theory suggested that babies attach for survival, and that initially form only one primary attachment, known as monotropy, and the attachment figure acts as a secure base for the child's eventual ability to branch out and explore the world. Although he did not dispute that young children form multiple attachments, he contended that the attachment to the mother is distinctly unique and that it is the first and strongest of all, and that the critical period when a child should receive the continuous care of this primary attachment figure is in the first 3 years of life.
Esme. It's raining. It's boring.
Without a strong maternal connection experience or the separation or loss of the mother, Bowlby hypothesized that deprivation or privation would heighten the probability towards delinquency, a reduced intelligence, an increased aggression, depression, or an affectionless psychopathy.
The figures that I was attached to and my experience of them as a child affected how I am now as an adult. When I was a baby, up until I was 4 years old, aside from my mom, I had a full-time nanny. And it's just now, as an adult, that I realized, like, oh wow, even my nanny had that big of an effect on me.
Like there is that secure attachment that enabled me to explore and to have healthy relationships.
But a very strong, secure attachment style in my early development.
And then there's a component of the avoidance in that it's an extension of this attempt to create some separation, and it shows up with kind of leave me alone sort of attitude.
The determinant of good attachment, according to John Bowlby, is caring effect and responsiveness.
The attachment was primarily to my mother and grandmother, and I would say that my grandmother was more of my mother figure than even my mother was.
I do feel some resonance with anxious, preoccupied attachment as an adult due to the fact that though I was given a lot of security as a child, I do remember my mom leaving a lot and coming home later at night.
Bowlby's attachment theory includes 3 attachment styles: secure attachment, insecure avoidant attachment, and insecure resistant attachment.
Knowing your attachment style, whether it's secure or insecure or disorganized attachment style, would help you know those ways in which you need to find ways of self-soothing when you are unattached.
This theory continues today to inform the development of an internal working model, which includes the idea that 1, others are trustworthy, 2, the self is valuable, and 3, the self is effective when interacting with others, and which guides future social and emotional behavior as a child's internal working model guides their responsiveness to others. Donald Winnicott contributed to the key aspect of healthy development as it is rooted in relationships and the micro-interactions with people, the focus being on object relations theory. Winnicott's notion of the good enough mother suggests that the child will develop a healthy false self, depending on the quality of care early on from the good enough mother, or, if absent, the result of an unhealthy false self.
When I'm by myself, sometimes the loneliness can be unbearable, and I realize that's it seems like it was just a similar experience from as a child and now.
Willingness to explore given the safety provided by a parent, and that has been the case for me.
Winnicott goes beyond that and asks, what is the amount of attunement a good enough mother or a primary care figure needs to be in a child's life in order to have normal development?
The good enough mother, who holds the environment and facilitates transition, and the role of the caregiver, is to foster the illusion of a unified experience and union, and over time cautiously and distinctly allows for the disillusionment, supporting the child's recognition of his own individuality. This separation usually occurs through play and the use of transitional objects, thereby facilitating that environment. The transitional object acts as comfort and points to not me identification.
And I just happen to have my transitional object that I grew up with when I got at birth.
Giant mouse that I loved. His name was Mousy Mouse.
For one, there was always a good friend that was actually a transitional object.
And obviously there was some sort of self-soothing going on because this lamb looked like a lamb with a music box. Obviously doesn't anymore, so.
Of course, the cell phone.
It's bad to say, but babysat a lot by television. You know, I have that vice that carries over into like my cell phone, and I'm really attached to like what's going on in social media or like who sent me a text, to the point where, you know, my husband sometimes is like, can you be here with me, and like put the phone down, and
It's
that
right
type of
here
thing,
and
so.
safe spot. Please don't worry. You know, I'll feel it vibrating even if it's not in my pocket. So.
My transitional object as an adult has really been my journal.
I have this stuffed toy that I sleep with and spray my husband's perfume on it.
If you notice me in class, you know, I'll pull out my phone several times to look at the time or to, you know, check very unimportant emails.
The culture and the time period played an important role in how the work of these two scholars were adopted by society at the time of their academic emergence. We are reminded that both of them were born in England around the turn of the 20th century, and because they were similar in their upbringing and principles, in which they had the same cultural perspective, the work that they did might not have necessarily translated to other cultures or patterns and context in the same way. We can assume that their common boarding school experience was most likely impacting their theoretical direction, as they both experienced a painful separation from their own families. The idea that mother is the preferred caregiver in their body of work was a direct result of the fact that women were not functioning in the workplace like men were. Homosexuality was not addressed and probably not culturally accepted at the time, So men who were raising children, either on their own or together, would have been essentially left out of the mix in terms of being recognized as a maternal first connection. Although today we realize that maternal instincts can reside in both men and women. In current psychological studies, the impact of the biological or genetic versus environmental factors have not been fully explored with regards to the bonding and attachment to a maternal figure, regardless of gender. It's also true that different countries express parent-child connection in different ways than we do in the West. In Germany, for example, children are taught to become independent from an early age, which may be one reason avoidant attachment tends to be more common with German infants. In Japan, mothers very rarely allow others to look after their children, which may help to explain why Japanese infants tend to display the greatest levels of resistant attachment. In the strange situation experiments devised by Mary Ainsworth in the cultural observance of children's attachment styles, it was concluded that Japanese infants displayed the greatest levels of resistant attachment. It is not surprising that its results appear controversial. The Western framework, where secure attachment is, quote, healthy, and resistant is somehow less so, it limits the cultural contextual application, especially in how attachment styles are labeled. Given that Japanese infants are rarely left by their mothers, even at night when they co-sleep, the strange situation experiment would have been particularly jarring for the Japanese infants. Hence, the reaction of the Japanese infants may have reflected more about Japanese cultural priorities of interdependence versus Western independence than about the healthful attachment of the infants.
The American style or the Western style of individual mother giving the care versus, say, the Gusi tribe of Kenya, in which the whole tribe gives continuous care to the child and the child is cared for on a continuous basis.
The valuing of attachment relations has a public policy and moral implication for society, not just psychological implications. Given the information we have, we know that where there are less environmental risk factors, there is more of a prominence of secure attachments. Poverty, low maternal age, education, family conflict, and maternal psychopathology all inform the success or the failure of solid attachment. When people's basic needs are taken care of, parents can be present in a way that was difficult in stress and striving. As stated earlier, it was determined that child development and environmental factors, most specifically a child's relationship to primary caregivers, was the critical factor in the ability for a child to attach. We learned from Bowlby and Winnicott that the first 3 years are critical to setting the stage for the initial blueprint for secure attachment. But we also know that the remaining 15 years of a child's life are just as important to reinforcing the original efforts in the bonding process. Along with the orphan child, it is the secure child whom we also find in literature and story. These are the children who are able to find their way back home to reconnect. The secure attachment they've been given translates into good planning, useful resources, and an ability to experience joy and fulfillment in an age-appropriate exercise of traveling out and returning home.
I think the work on infant attachment is fascinating and so important.
These theorists that were studying Bowlby and Winnicott, their theories, are very important to understanding who we are, getting to our true, authentic selves.
And it just is fascinating to see how early we're affected by that and how it kind of continues on to the way that we develop relationships with other people throughout our lives.
We know now that in the necessary exploration of life, good attachment sets us to develop strong and healthy relationships and lessens the struggle to bond and succeed. Thank you for your work in child development and psychology, John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott.
I love puppies. I do love my mom. I appreciate my cell phone.
For the people that I'm really attached to, I'm really attached to them.
Although you see the world different than me, sometimes I can touch upon the wonders that you see, and all the new colors and pictures you've designed. Oh, yes, sweet darling, so glad you are a child of mine. Child of mine, child of mine. Oh, yes, sweet darling, so glad you are a child of mine. You don't need directions, you know which way to go.